Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Doing a reaction video of some sorts, kind of a reflection video, just wondering what the hell happened to the NFC North, a division powerhouse this year in the National Football League. Entering the playoffs, I don't think there was any doubt, any contenders to the NFC North when it came to the label of the best division in football. I know the AFC West had three teams get in with the Broncos, the Chargers, and the Chiefs. But the Vikings, the Lions, the Packers were kind of known as the cream of the crop when it came to the best overall division in the National Football League. I mean, the Vikings finished with, 14 wins, 13 wins, and they were a wild card team. And now we're not even to the end of the divisional round weekend, and all three are done. And the best division in football not only won't even have a representative in the conference championship, the best division in football by almost everyone's account this year didn't even win a playoff game. Vikings get manhandled by the Rams last week. Packers lose to the Eagles in a miserable outing where they put up 10 points. And the Lions, who earned themselves a bye in the top seed in the NFC, come out on Saturday night and get 45 hung up on them in a loss to rookie quarterback Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders. And we're going to look at each team. I was going to do it last week, but really focused in on the Packers' loss to Philadelphia. Let's start with the Vikings, because I'm telling you, and I'll put some of the screenshots up here, I heard over and over and over and over again all year long about how Sam Darnold was the real deal, about how having Kevin O'Connell in the Vikings was all he needed to turn it around. And I granted Vikings fans some of that. I said certainly getting drafted by the Jets did Sam Darnold no favors in his career. You're talking about a place where it's like, it's not even quarterback purgatory. It's where quarterbacks go to have their careers just completely evaporate. And so he was drafted into a bad spot with not many pieces around him, not a great coaching staff. It wasn't going to work out for Darnold with the New York Jets. And then he moved on to Carolina, where it was a similar situation. And we saw Baker Mayfield make kind of that step where it was like Cleveland, and I thought he was okay in Cleveland, but they wanted what they deemed to be a bigger fish in the pond, and they went and got Deshaun Watson. And Baker went to Carolina, and it never worked out. Now he's landed on his feet in Tampa Bay, and Sam Darnold had to take a route where he went to the Jets, and then he went to the Panthers, and then he backed up Brock Purdy in San Francisco, and he comes to Minnesota. And I think stability and competence with a franchise and a coaching staff and a front office will help a quarterback, even someone like Darnold, who had struggled throughout his career. But for all those Vikings fans who are in the comments, and even some of my buddies who I love to death, who are Vikings fans, and I heard it over and over and over and over again, like they thought the sample size of Sam Darnold is large enough this regular season with the Vikings, they could win a Super Bowl. And I said over and over and over again, go back and watch past videos. Go watch my instant reactions after both losses, when the Packers lost twice this year to Minnesota, any of my NFC North breakdowns where I talked about Darnold. I was genuinely happy for the dude, because I thought he was just drafted into a pretty shitty situation with the Jets, moved on to Carolina, it wasn't much better, and now he was getting a crack, and he got to look around the canvas and say, hey, I've got a good head coach in Kevin O'Connell, I got arguably the best wide receiver in football in Justin Jefferson, I've got a good offensive line, I got a veteran running back in Aaron Jones. It was a good spot for Sam Darnold, and I don't want him to beat the Packers. I don't ever want the Vikings to be better than Green Bay. But I was happy for the player and the dude that he got to taste some success, and we got to see some of the things that so many scouts salivated over when he was coming out of USC and was a first-round pick. But I said over and over and over again, in the big moments, in the big games, I don't see it. I don't see it with Sam Darnold. And so the regular season, you have big games. And he showed up at Lambeau Field. The Vikings led that game 28-0. He had a great first half. And he showed up the second time around when they beat the Packers at US Bank Stadium near the end of the regular season. I still said in those big moments, those standalone games, when the lights are truly the brightest, I did not trust with Sam Darnold. I've said repeatedly in videos, I cannot envision Sam Darnold, even in the best of situations, being a quarterback that leads a team to hoisting a Lombardi trophy. And in the regular season finale in a standalone game on Sunday Night Football, they got absolutely slaughtered by the Detroit Lions, and Sam Darnold was terrible. And on Wild Card Weekend, they got dismantled by the Los Angeles Rams in a game where I will say the offensive line was not good for the Vikings, but Darnold held onto the ball far too long. The game plans seemed to revolve around long developing routes where at times he didn't have the time in the pocket to try to bide that time to wait for those long developing routes. I just thought everything came to a head against the Rams where I didn't necessarily think the blueprint was great. The offensive line wasn't great, but Darnold certainly wasn't good for the Vikings. And I had said it over and over again, even after all these comments about, Sam Darnold can be the guy. Sam Darnold can be the guy. And I mean, there were Viking fans talking about him needing to be in the MVP running 8-9 weeks in. And it's like, the stats might be there, but in big moments, is he going to be the guy? And I'm wrong about a lot of things. I felt good about this one, that Sam Darnold would just not be a dude that's going to lead a team to a Super Bowl trophy. And you give the Vikings credit because entering this season, the expectations could not have been that. Vegas and all these outlets had them as, I think their win total was 5.5 or 6.5, like a team that was supposed to finish well off the mark as far as even being a contender for the postseason. They weren't supposed to sniff it. And so they overachieved, at least what the outside expectations were. And so you give them credit for that, but it started to get nauseating. It started to get, if you're not a Vikings fan, but you're a fan of a team in the NFC North, whether it's Detroit, Chicago, Green Bay, it started to get kind of just flat out annoying because I think a lot of people could see the car crash coming and Vikings fans couldn't. And, I do think his struggles the last 2 weeks, they were so great. The struggles were like, I don't mean great as like hilarious. I mean great like they were so magnified. It was so bad for Sam Darnold those last 2 weeks in the regular season finale against Detroit and then wild card weekend on a neutral field in Arizona against the LA Rams that I do believe, despite what Kevin O'Connell and the front office has said since the season ended, it's made their decision easy. They're going to move on from Sam Darnold. I don't think they're going to entertain the franchise tag. I certainly don't think they're going to entertain a long-term extension with Darnold. I do think there's usually always, I don't want to say a sucker, because I think Darnold proved this year that he can be an adequate starting quarterback. But again, if the goal is a Super Bowl, I don't think he's that guy. I don't see it, and we didn't see it in those last two games. So I don't want to say there's always a sucker, but there's going to be someone who gives Darnold an extension this offseason, gives him a chance to start. I don't think it's the Vikings. I don't. From Darnold's perspective, I think he's going to bring to the table his season as a whole instead of the last 2 weeks. And, his case will be that he's earned the starting job for next year. And I believe that if the Vikings present him with another short deal and they say, hey, it's an open competition, between you and JJ, he's going to be able to read through the tea leaves and be like, okay, they're going to give JJ every opportunity to start next year. Darnold certainly will want to start somewhere. He wants a starting gig, and I think he's deserved that. I don't want to contradict what I'm saying. I think Darnold earned the right to be a starting quarterback next year, but again, it's just not a guy that if your ultimate goal is to win a championship that he can be the guy. It's just not, but someone will take the bait. They just will. But from a Packers fan perspective, knowing how I felt about Darnold, I was hoping to thread the needle where the Vikings would get, pushed out of the playoffs early like they did, but that Darnold would play well enough that the Vikings would have to waffle with the decision in the offseason of whether or not to give him an extension and maybe crazy idea, trade J.J. McCarthy somewhere and really invest in Darnold, or at least have both of them duke it out, but give Darnold a 2 or 3 year deal. That's what I was hoping for, and I think most Packer fans probably were, and Lions fans and Bears fans too. The decision, I think, after these 2 games is easy. They move on, and I'm not a huge J.J. McCarthy guy, but I think you give him the keys and see what he has, because Kevin O'Connell has proven that, like he's done with a couple of quarterbacks now. I don't want to call him a quarterback whisperer, but he can get the best out of a lot of these guys. And it's crazy to me that there were some Viking fans that are calling for Kevin O'Connell to go. Like, to me, that's just laughable. Was the game plan great against the Rams? No, I don't think it was. But I think his resume has already spoken for itself in his first few years as the head coach of the Vikings. And last thing I'll say about Minnesota, I hope Brian Flores gets a head coaching job. I hope he does, because I think his defense, that dude, Brian Flores is a really, 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 really good defensive coordinator, and he's aggressive and he takes chances and he's a risk taker, and I appreciate that. And I look at that depth chart for the Vikings, and they've got some good players on the defensive side, and they've got a big veteran presence in Harrison Smith, who's been there for what seems like an eternity. But it is not a group or a defense that's littered with superstars. And yet they played superstar caliber defense for a lot of the season. Again, against Detroit in the regular season finale, they didn't, but the offense didn't do them any favors. It felt like the Vikings defense was on the field most of the game, and kind of the same thing against the Rams, where the offense had quick drives and they just weren't on the field much, and that was a tired, fatigued Minnesota defense. Me saying I hope Brian Flores gets a head coaching gig is a compliment, because I don't want him in this division, because I think his defense can cause chaos and nightmares for opposing offenses, and certainly the Packers saw their fair share of that at certain times in the last couple of seasons, and I know he's been interviewing for a head coaching gig. So I hope Brian Flores gets a head coaching job. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. NFC North bows out. Packers, Vikings, Lions, not one win. Like that. That part's crazy to me. You know, not having a representative in the conference championship, had you told me that entering the playoffs, I'll be honest, I didn't think the Packers were going to beat Philly. I didn't think Minnesota was going to beat LA, but I thought that was way more of a coin toss. I expected Detroit to at least make the NFC championship. So to me, it's stunning that the division doesn't have a representative in the conference championship. But then to add on the layer that not one even won a playoff game is just... It truly is mind-boggling, and we'll pivot to Detroit. You know what's interesting? I'll start with this. Lions fans, for the most part, I would say like 90%, Lions fans that have commented on my videos, whether it's post-game reactions, previews, NFC North talk, just this season, obviously, as I just started the channel a few months ago, Lions fans that I've interacted with on YouTube, far friendlier, far more level-headed than Lions Twitter in what I see. And I don't interact on Twitter with anyone. I don't, tweet responses, replies. I just do a bunch of scrolling through sports stuff. And it's probably the case for a lot of fan bases, the difference between, like how they are on YouTube and how they are on Twitter. But, most of the Lions fans' comments I've had on my YouTube page this season have been cordial, friendly, complimentary, even about the Packers and certain position groups when I went back and looked. And Twitter is just like, or X is just like one gigantic, chaotic fight, I guess, between fan bases. And I did notice that difference throughout the season. As it pertains to Detroit, we'll go small picture this game against Washington. Even with all the injuries on defense, I was stunned. I was stunned that they lost to Washington, and that, that's not a knock on Jaden Daniels, who's been incredible. He'll be the offensive rookie of the year. And Washington, went into Tampa Bay and got a big win. They're red hot. What have they won? 6 in a row, 7 in a row after beating Detroit. It's 6 or 7. And so it was a red hot team who seemed to be figuring out. Cliff Kingsbury just pushed all the right buttons on offense Saturday in that win for Washington over Detroit. I didn't see it coming. There's that element, I think, with some teams in some seasons where the word like fate comes into play. And I wasn't convinced because of the injuries on defense. I wasn't convinced the Lions were going to win the whole thing. And primarily because I looked at the AFC and I was like, I think Baltimore or Buffalo will give Kansas City everything and then some. And I think whoever wins, depending on when you're watching this, maybe the game's final by now, I think whoever wins between Baltimore and Buffalo will beat Kansas City and Arrowhead. And then that was my thought process. Like, I think Buffalo or Baltimore could get Detroit in the Super Bowl just based off where they're at. And again, the injuries, even if Hutchinson came back for Detroit, is he going to be, a full go, 50% snaps, 20% snaps? Who knows? We'll never have that answer now. I thought, though, I truly believed that Detroit would, at a minimum, be in the NFC Championship. And as the cards kind of fell on the table, I thought, them getting Washington and then either Philly or LA, I just thought it was setting up nicely for the Lions. So I was completely shocked when they lost to Washington. And it was one of those games, like, even when it was the pick six and it's 24-14 in the first half, Washington's up, I'm sitting there thinking, like, okay, they're going to figure it out. They're going to come back and win. And it's 31-21 at halftime. And I'm like, Detroit's going to come back and win. And it's 38-28 as the second half unfolds and unravels. And I'm like, Detroit's going to come back and win. It really wasn't until like midway through the fourth quarter where I started to pivot and think, oh my gosh, like I knew they were in trouble because, I mean, Washington's punter was nowhere to be seen. Detroit just kept driving down the field repeatedly. And in a sense, they got beat at their own game because Dan Quinn, just as aggressive as Dan Campbell going for it on these fourth downs, Washington just didn't get the credit for it because Dan Campbell's been doing it for a couple of years. This was Dan Quinn's first season as the head coach in Washington. But Washington's been doing that all season long, going for it on fourth downs, being uber aggressive. I am not, I would say in the NFL compared to other sports, I'm not typically like shocked, stunned. I was. And maybe I shouldn't have been because of all the injuries on defense. And I hope that's not used as an excuse for the Lions because a lot of the guys that were out in this game against Washington have been out for a long time now, and they've had the time to adjust. And I know they lost a couple of guys in game again, but they've seemed to really rally around that. And with defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, that's why I just 45 in their home building coming off a bye week. And I thought the bye week was so critical for them because they were banged up and because their bye week initially in the regular season came way early on. I think Detroit had like a week 5 bye, somewhere around there this year. And so I thought their matchup against Minnesota in week 18 was more pivotal for the Lions to get the bye than Minnesota. And it wasn't like they came out flat. Washington's just red hot right now. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I kept thinking when they were down 10 or whatever it was that they were just going to piece the puzzle together, and they could not get over the hump. And so now you have two big questions with Detroit. And this trickles down to the NFC North, and certainly the Green Bay Packers will have, the fan base will have interest in this. It's offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn. It seems like both are going to get offers for head coaching jobs. You know, right now, Ben Johnson, it sounds like Raiders, Bears, maybe the Jags come back into the picture. For Aaron Glenn, it's more Jets, Saints oriented, it sounds like. You know, Ben Johnson was a hot commodity last year, even for the Washington job, which he ended up passing on. It sounded like he had every opportunity to accept that job if he wanted it and passed on it. I'd be surprised if Ben Johnson is back as the offensive coordinator. I think we were slightly surprised he came back this year, not because it's Detroit, but because he was already a hot commodity name last offseason. So for him to pass through 2 cycles would be somewhat surprising. Aaron Glenn also seems like he might get an offer either from the Saints or the Jets. I would be less surprised if Glenn is back compared to Ben Johnson. Like if Aaron Glenn's gone next year but Ben Johnson's back, that's the scenario where I'd be like, wow, I'd be pretty stunned. And so the ripple effect to all this is like the Lions presumably are still going to be really good, but it will be very, very, very interesting to see how they look without 1 or 2 of their coordinators next year with new faces in those roles. And I believe Dan Campbell's a good coach. I really do. And I think he is a master motivator. He gets that team to play for him. They buy into every message. It's never in one ear, out the other. They play their ass off for Dan Campbell. That is evident. It's clear as day. Next year, though, we're really going to be able to see sort of the validity into how good of a coach is Dan Campbell. And I think he is. I believe he is. But we're talking about right now who's regarded as what? The best offensive coordinator in football in Ben Johnson? I mean, the hottest commodity head coaching name that's being flirted around the last 2 years. And Aaron Glenn, who's a really good defensive coordinator, despite what happened against Washington, despite what some Lions fans I'm seeing say on Twitter about, I'm seeing Lions fans saying, pack Aaron Glenn's bags, pack Jared Goff's bag. It's like, that's just, that's the initial shock coming in after your season ends when you didn't expect it to end. And I don't think many people expected it to end, on the divisional round weekend. But you're talking about 2 coordinators that, like with the Lions offense, Dan Campbell gets the credit for, laying his balls on the field and going for it on all these fourth downs, and it's incredibly admirable. Outside of that, I feel like the perception is that Ben Johnson gets almost all the credit with the offense for the creativity and the scheme and the play calling and the blueprints that are laid out week in and week out. if you polled people, I think they would give more credit to Ben Johnson than Dan Campbell for the offense. The defense, I don't know, but it's two very good coordinators. I'm just curious to see what it looks like if both of those guys are gone for Dan Campbell and they reload with two new coordinators, and what that picture looks like for Detroit, because the talent is still there. Like, Detroit's a team I look at, and I don't know how many teams have as many superstars as they do. Penei Sewell's a superstar. Aiden Hutchinson's a superstar. Jahmyr Gibbs is a budding superstar. Amon-Ra St. Brown's a superstar. Kirby Joseph is a superstar. They're loaded. They're young, too, at a lot of those positions. The coordinator switches that are expected to happen this offseason could tilt things a bit, but the talent is still there for Detroit. I just wonder how much more, I'm not in the building. I wonder how much more involved Dan Campbell is going to have to be with things. And I'm not saying he's not now. He certainly is. But it did seem like Detroit's offense was in a spot where it was like, let Ben Johnson cook. And he's pushing all the right buttons at the controls for these last couple of years for the Lions. Now he might be gone, assuming he will be gone. Aaron Glenn, similar situation. So I'm curious to see that dynamic and how it plays out. As for Goff, I don't put too much stock into Jared Goff's sort of off night with the 4 turnovers. I truly believe Jared Goff is still a guy that if you want to win a championship, he can be your quarterback. I think he's good enough. I do. He's been in, one with the Rams. They lost to the Patriots, wasn't like 13-3 or something, so it wasn't a great outing for the Rams offense. But I do believe in Jared Goff as being a quarterback that, yes, you can win a Super Bowl with him as your starting quarterback. I don't feel, like I said, that way about Sam Darnold. But with Detroit's looming turnover coming to the coaching staff, is it going to be the same scheme on defense? What does the offense look like? You'd almost want to simplify things and be like, hey, we can still feed the two-headed monster and Gibbs and Montgomery and lean on that, but know that we have Laporta and Jameson Williams can take the lid off any secondary, and you have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's an all-pro, and an incredible offensive line. Like, the talent is certainly still there. That doesn't mean they won't go. I think they're almost destined to go through more hurdles and have more adversity next year. Not injury-wise. I'm talking wins and losses-wise. Because even when injuries hit this year, they just kept freaking winning. And you look at that schedule, they're going to have a first-place schedule next year. I looked at their road opponents, and it's brutal. So the Lions, the big thing to watch is I would be floored if both were back, Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. Is one of them gone, two of them gone with head coaching gigs? That's the thing to watch with them. Mitch, I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Finish up with the Packers. We'll keep it brief on Green Bay because obviously I do Packer videos for the bulk of things. One thing we hadn't touched on is Goody had his sort of end-of-the-season presser earlier in the week. He mentioned a championship window, which usually he doesn't, and he mentioned the word urgency a couple of times when speaking about a championship window, and that kind of had me giddy. We've known for decades now the Packers, Ted Thompson, and now Goody, it's draft, develop, homegrown talent, in-house talent, re-sign those guys, keep it that way. And last year we saw them sort of veer off that path a little bit with two big splashes, Josh Jacobs, Xavier McKinney. And I think looking back, you could say not only were those two big impactful signings, Xavier McKinney has a case to be Green Bay's best defensive player last year. Josh Jacobs has a case to be Green Bay's best offensive player this past season. That's how good those signings were. They'll have cap space. They'll have flexibility. Obviously, we don't know what they're going to do with Jair Alexander. There's a couple names out there. You have free agency. Names like Josh Myers, Eric Stokes is out there, fifth-year options. What do you do with Quay Walker? What do you do with Devontae Wyatt? We'll get into all those videos throughout the offseason. I did like, though, that Goody mentioned a championship window. He mentioned urgency. It made me think that he's going to dip the toes back into the water into free agency for the Packers, which obviously I would love to see based off the success rate that they hit on last offseason. There's clear holes that need to be filled. You guys know how I feel about what I'd like to see them do at wide receiver. One looming thing with the Packers for next season, it seems forever away, but I promise you, and I'll bring this up throughout the offseason videos, there will be a level of pressure, I believe, on the shoulders of Matt LaFleur and Jordan Love separately that neither of them has had yet. A level of pressure on both of their shoulders separately, but they're going to have to work together, obviously, to alleviate that they have not seen yet. LaFleur comes in and, some immediate success with Aaron Rodgers MVPs, conference championship appearances, no Super Bowl appearances, and then you turn the keys over to Jordan Love and, not this past season, but the season before, expectation, it was just a big question mark. And Green Bay goes to the playoffs. And, oh, my gosh, they blow out Dallas on Wild Card Weekend. And, oh, my gosh, they should have beat San Francisco and Santa Clara but didn't. So I thought the expectations coming into this season were raised. And they really started on a downward slope as the season ended. Losses to Minnesota, Chicago at home, and then in the playoffs, and a dud against Philadelphia. And we saw the passing game regress and go on a downward slope as the season ended. Whereas in the first year with Jordan Love, you lost to San Francisco. It left a sour taste in your mouth, but it was like, oh my gosh. I mean, people were talking about Jordan Love as like an MVP candidate for this season, and it never happened. And he was banged up early in the year. He dealt with, 3 different injuries? I get all that. It does not change the fact that next season, I believe if the Packers are a wild card team again, and they're one and done in the playoffs, and they lose wild card weekend, it could start getting uncomfortable inside the building as far as the pressure just really amping up, and then you're talking about a hot seat. I believe there will be that weight on the shoulders of Matt LaFleur next year and Jordan Love to produce and give results and have postseason success. And, when's the last time the Packers won a home playoff game? Was the last time the Packers won a home playoff game when they beat the Rams and then lost the next week to the Buccaneers in the NFC Championship at Lambeau? Was that the last time they won? I know the NFC North was loaded this year. I know the Lions, even if they lose their coordinators, still have the talent and the roster in place. But win the division. You got to win the division. Get a home playoff game. Make it a little bit easier for yourselves. I think the big thing for the offseason is how are they going to deal with that? I think the pressure they're going to feel, too, is both internally and externally. It's going to be inside the building and outside the building that they're going to have. And it's not a dark cloud, but it's just you got to deliver. I think next year is a critical year for LaFleur and Jordan Love, both. And Goody's talking championship window. He's talking urgency. That only raises it even more. They know this is a time to pounce and a time to attack. But, yeah, overall, NFC North, geez. 0-3 in the playoffs. And now you're looking at the NFC East as potentially the cream of the crop. If the Eagles take out the Rams, again, depending on when you watch this video, it would be an all NFC East conference championship. I don't think anyone saw that coming. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. We'll see you next time.